From desert sand to global power, Saudi Arabia built a financial empire on oil. But as the world moves beyond it, can the kingdom survive or will it collapse? Subscribe to Zimo Voice for the full story. For centuries, the Arabian Peninsula was a land defined by vast deserts, scattered oases, and tribal societies bound by tradition, faith, and survival in one of the world's harshest climates. The Bedouin tribes moved across the sands with their camels, trading goods and stories, carrying on a way of life that seemed timeless. Few could have imagined that beneath these endless dunes lay a treasure so vast it would reshape not only the destiny of Arabia, but the balance of power in the entire world. The discovery of oil in the 20th century would transform Saudi Arabia from a desert kingdom into one of the richest nations on earth. But this is not merely a story of oil wealth. It is a story of how that wealth was used, guarded, and projected, how Saudi Arabia rose to become a financial empire, a kingdom whose influence stretches far beyond its borders, shaping global markets, geopolitics, and even the spiritual life of more than 1 billion Muslims around the world. To understand this transformation, we must first return to the early 20th century. At that time, Arabia was far from the bustling cities and shining towers we know today. It was a land of caravans and small settlements. In 1932, Abdulaziz ibn Saud unified the warring tribes and founded the Kingdom of Saudi Arabia. His rule came at a time when the world was in flux, with great powers struggling for dominance. The British Empire still cast its shadow over much of the Middle East, but another force, the rising power of the United States, was beginning to look outward, seeking resources that could fuel its industrial engine. In 1938, everything changed. In the eastern province of Saudi Arabia, near Iran, prospectors struck oil. It was a moment that would alter the fate of the kingdom forever. What followed was a flood of wealth and foreign interest. American companies, through what would become Aramco, the Arabian-American Oil Company, began pumping millions of barrels of crude from beneath the sands. For Saudi Arabia, a nation that had once relied on pilgrim taxes and modest trade, this was a new dawn. But oil wealth was both a blessing and a burden. It gave the kingdom power and leverage, but it also made it the focus of global competition. The rulers of Saudi Arabia understood this well. They used oil not just as fuel, but as a political weapon. By controlling the spigot of the world's most essential resource, they could bend markets and influence superpowers. The oil boom of the 1970s brought unimaginable riches. The price of crude skyrocketed, filling the kingdom's coffers with billions of dollars. Riyadh, Jeddah, and Dammam transformed almost overnight. Where once stood small towns, now rose highways, airports, and glittering palaces. Skyscrapers began to pierce the desert sky, and Western luxury goods flooded the market. But alongside the development came something else, a system of patronage and power. Oil money flowed not only into infrastructure, but also into the pockets of elites, solidifying loyalty to the House of Saud. Yet, the kingdom did not simply hoard its wealth. It reinvested it on a global scale. Saudi petrodollars poured into Western banks, real estate, and corporations. In New York, London, Paris, and Geneva, Saudi investments became a quiet but powerful force. The kingdom was no longer just an oil supplier. It was becoming a financial empire, with stakes and stability of the global system itself. At the same time, Saudi Arabia positioned itself as the guardian of Islam's two holiest sites, Mecca and Medina. This gave the monarchy not only financial power, but also religious legitimacy. Each year, millions of Muslims traveled to the kingdom for the Hajj pilgrimage, reinforcing Saudi Arabia's central role in the Islamic world. Oil wealth funded the construction of massive mosques, universities, and religious institutions, spreading the kingdom's influence far beyond its borders. But with power came responsibility, and with wealth came vulnerability. Saudi Arabia faced challenges from within and without. Radical movements that rejected the monarchy's close ties with the West, regional rivals like Iran, and the constant risk of oil price shocks that could undermine its economic stability. And so, the House of Saud embarked on a delicate balancing act, maintaining its grip on power, securing its wealth, and projecting influence abroad, all while navigating a volatile Middle East and a shifting global order. This is a story of how a desert kingdom, once dismissed as barren and insignificant, built a financial empire that continues to shape our world today. The rise of Aramco marked a turning point, not only for Saudi Arabia, but also for the global oil industry. In its early years, Aramco was dominated by American companies. Standard Oil of California, later Chevron, had secure concessions that allowed them to explore and drill in the kingdom. Soon, other American giants, such as Texaco and Exxon, joined the venture. By mid-century, Aramco had become the central artery through which Saudi oil flowed to the world. But the House of Saud was careful not to be a mere spectator. They demanded an increasing share of the profits, asserting sovereignty over their most valuable resource. By the 1970s, the Saudi government began taking gradual control of Aramco until, by 1980, it was fully nationalized. The Arabian-American Oil Company became Saudi Aramco, the crown jewel of the kingdom's economy, and today the most profitable company in the world. The oil crisis of 1973 would catapult Saudi Arabia onto the world stage in a way no one could ignore. In response to Western support for Israel during the Yom Kippur War, Arab oil producers, led by Saudi Arabia, imposed an embargo. Overnight, the price of oil quadrupled. Gas stations in the United States and Europe ran dry. Long lines of cars stretched for blocks. For the first time, ordinary people in the West realized just how dependent they were on the oil flowing from the sands of Arabia. This was Saudi Arabia's great revelation to the world. Oil was not just a commodity, it was a weapon. And in wielding it, the kingdom demonstrated its newfound power. The embargo cemented Saudi Arabia's role as a central player in OPEC, the Organization of Petroleum Exporting Countries, and as a de facto swing producer of global oil markets. The petrodollars that flooded into Saudi Arabia during this time reshaped not only its own economy, but also the global financial system. Vast sums were deposited in Western banks, recycled into loans to developing countries, and invested in real estate, weapons, and luxury goods. Riyadh, once a sleepy desert town, became a capital of wealth. In cities across the United States and Europe, Saudi investments quietly bought up skyscrapers, hotels, and companies. But this sudden wealth created both opportunities and challenges for the kingdom. The rulers of Saudi Arabia faced the task of transforming a traditional society into a modern state almost overnight. Roads, hospitals, and schools were built at breathtaking speed. Universities sprang up, offering education to a new generation. Entire cities like Jubail and Yanbu were constructed from scratch, designed as industrial hubs to diversify the economy. Yet, modernization also came at a cost. Rapid development bred inequality. Those connected to the royal family and ruling elites prospered immensely, while others remained marginalized. Oil revenues made it easy to overlook structural reforms. Why diversify when oil money seemed limitless? Why tax citizens when oil could pay the bills? The kingdom became a rentier state, where loyalty to the monarchy was secured not by democratic participation, but by the distribution of wealth. Internationally, Saudi Arabia's wealth allowed it to cement alliances with the world's most powerful countries. Billions of dollars in arms deals flowed to the United States and Europe, binding Western defense industries to the stability of the kingdom. In return, Saudi Arabia gained protection, a security guarantee that has lasted decades. But as much as the kingdom thrived, its very wealth also made it a target. Enemies abroad and extremists within began to see Saudi Arabia not just as a custodian of holy sites, but as a symbol of Western entanglement, corruption, and excess. By the end of the 1970s, Saudi Arabia had become more than a desert kingdom enriched by oil. It was now a financial empire whose money coursed through the veins of global markets, a kingdom whose decisions could shake economies from Washington to Tokyo. The 1980s ushered in a turbulent new era for Saudi Arabia. The Middle East was on fire. In 1979, the Iranian Revolution toppled the Shah, replacing pro-Western monarchy with an Islamic republic that vowed to export its ideology across the region. For Saudi Arabia, this was an existential threat. The kingdom, a monarchy tied closely to the United States, suddenly found itself face-to-face with a revolutionary regime that questioned its legitimacy and its control over Islam's holiest sites. The same year, another shock shook the kingdom. The siege of the Grand Mosque in Mecca by extremists who accused the Saudi royal family of corruption and betrayal of Islamic values. For 2 weeks, the holiest site in Islam was under siege. The government's bloody retaking of the mosque was a turning point. To appease conservative clerics and prevent further unrest, the Saudi state doubled down on its partnership with the religious establishment. Billions of dollars of oil money were poured into spreading Wahhabi Islam across the globe, funding mosques, schools, and preachers from Africa to Asia. Meanwhile, the Iran-Iraq War erupted in 1980, pitting two of Saudi Arabia's neighbors against each other in a brutal 8-year conflict. Saudi Arabia, fearing Iran's revolutionary influence, funneled billions into supporting Saddam Hussein's Iraq. Once again, oil wealth became a tool of geopolitics, financing proxy wars that reshaped the region. Yet, the oil market was not immune to instability. By the mid-1980s, global oversupply caused prices to collapse, plunging from over $30 a barrel to below $10. For Saudi Arabia, whose entire economy depended on oil, this was a rude awakening. The kingdom was forced to cut spending, dip into reserves, and rethink its financial strategies. The myth of infinite wealth began to crack. The 1990s brought yet another test. In 1990, Saddam Hussein invaded Kuwait, sending shockwaves through the Gulf. For Saudi Arabia, the threat was existential. Iraqi troops were suddenly on its border, and the possibility of invasion loomed large. The House of Saud turned to its most powerful ally, the United States. In a controversial move, American troops were invited to Saudi soil to protect the kingdom and launch Operation Desert Storm to liberate Kuwait. The war was won, but the consequences were lasting. Many Muslims around the world, and within Saudi Arabia itself, viewed the presence of U.S. forces in the land of Mecca and Medina as an affront. Among those enraged was a wealthy Saudi by the name of Osama bin Laden, who would later become the mastermind of Al-Qaeda. Thus, the seeds of new threats were sown, threats that would come back to haunt the kingdom in the years ahead. Despite the turmoil, the 1990s also cemented Saudi Arabia's status as a financial empire. With petrodollars recycled into global banks and investments, the kingdom became deeply intertwined with the economies of the West. Saudi sovereign wealth and private investors bought stakes in major corporations, real estate, and financial institutions. By doing so, Saudi Arabia ensured that its stability was not just its own concern. It became a cornerstone of the global economic order. At home, however, challenges persisted. A growing population demanded jobs, education, and housing. The oil wealth that once seemed limitless was being stretched thin. Corruption scandals and inefficiencies exposed cracks in the system. While glittering skyscrapers rose in Riyadh and Jeddah, rural areas and poorer citizens often felt left behind. By the dawn of the new millennium, Saudi Arabia stood at a crossroads. It had survived revolutions, wars, and oil shocks. It had projected its power through petrodollars and religious influence. Yet, new storms were brewing: extremism, terrorism, an inevitable question of what would happen when oil could no longer sustain the weight of an entire empire. The dawn of the 21st century brought with it the single greatest challenge Saudi Arabia had ever faced. On September 11, 2001, the world watched in horror as hijacked planes struck the Twin Towers in New York and the Pentagon in Washington, D.C. In the aftermath, it was revealed that 15 of the 19 hijackers were Saudi citizens. The news sent shockwaves through the kingdom and placed it at the center of global suspicion. The U.S., Saudi Arabia's closest ally, began asking hard questions. How could so many of the attackers have come from the kingdom? What role had Saudi-funded religious schools and charities played in fostering extremism? The House of Saud suddenly found itself under a microscope. The monarchy denied any direct involvement, but it could not ignore the fact that the ideologies it had supported abroad were now tied to one of the worst terrorist attacks in history. At home, Saudi Arabia was not immune to the violence. Between 2003 and 2006, Al-Qaeda launched a bloody insurgency inside the kingdom, targeting foreign compounds, oil facilities, and even government sites. The Saudi state responded with an iron fist, mass arrests, intelligence crackdowns, and aggressive counterterrorism campaigns. Billions of dollars were spent not only on security, but also on programs aimed at de-radicalizing young extremists. Gradually, the insurgency was quelled, but the scars remained. Meanwhile, the global oil market once again worked in Saudi Arabia's favor. The 2000s saw prices soar, driven by rising demand from China and India. Billions flowed back into Saudi coffers. The kingdom used this windfall to expand its financial reach, investing heavily in American and European markets, buying stakes in companies, and strengthening its sovereign wealth funds. Oil wealth once again cushioned the kingdom against its political and security troubles. Yet beneath the surface, a new crisis was brewing: demographics. The Saudi population was exploding, with millions of young people entering the workforce each year. They wanted jobs, opportunities, and modern lifestyles. But the oil economy, relying on foreign labor and state subsidies, could not absorb them all. Youth unemployment climbed and frustration simmered. The Arab Spring of 2011 only deepened the monarchy's anxieties. Across the Middle East, rulers' fellow citizens demanded democracy, jobs, and dignity. In Tunisia, Egypt, and Libya, long-standing regimes collapsed. In Syria and Yemen, brutal wars erupted. Saudi Arabia, fearful of unrest at home, responded swiftly. The monarchy unleashed a massive spending spree, billions on housing subsidies and public sector jobs, to buy loyalty and keep protests off its streets. At the same time, it played a decisive role abroad, supporting allied regimes and countering uprisings that threatened its influence. By the mid-2010s, it was clear to the Saudi leadership that oil alone could not sustain the future. Prices had begun to fall again, and technological advances in fracking meant that even America was becoming less dependent on Middle Eastern crude. The question was no longer if the oil age would end, but when. Into this moment stepped a new figure, Crown Prince Mohammed bin Salman, known as MBS. Young, ambitious, and bold, he launched an ambitious plan called Vision 2030. Its goal was nothing less than to wean Saudi Arabia off oil and transform it into a diversified economy. Vision 2030 promised futuristic megaprojects like NEOM, a $500 billion city in the desert, a thriving tourism sector, entertainment industries, and a modern, dynamic society. But reform came hand in hand with repression. MBS cracked down on dissent, sidelined rivals within the royal family, and concentrated power in his hands. High-profile arrests of businessmen and princes under the banner of anti-corruption sent a chilling message: no one was untouchable. Internationally, MBS projected Saudi Arabia as a nation in transition, modernizing, empowering women, opening cinemas, and allowing concerts. Yet, the kingdom also found itself mired in controversy, from the devastating war in Yemen to the murder of journalist Jamal Khashoggi, which sparked global outrage. Still, the vision of a new Saudi Arabia pressed forward. Oil wealth was no longer seen as the sole foundation of power, but as a seed money for a new empire, one rooted in finance, technology, tourism, and global investment. By the end of the 2010s, Saudi Arabia was no longer just an oil giant. It was a country in transformation, balancing tradition and modernity, ambition and risk, reform and repression. And as the world moved into a new era of uncertainty, one question lingered: could the kingdom truly reinvent itself, or would the weight of its past drag it back into the sand of history? The new decade opened with turbulence. In early 2020, the world was struck by the COVID-19 pandemic. As global economies went into lockdown, demand for oil collapsed. Prices plummeted to levels unseen in decades. At one point, U.S. crude futures even went negative. For Saudi Arabia, whose budget still depended heavily on oil exports, it was a sobering reminder that black gold could no longer be the sole guarantee of stability. Yet, where others saw a crisis, the Saudi leadership saw opportunity. Crown Prince Mohammed bin Salman pressed forward with his sweeping transformation plan, Vision 2030. Even as revenues shrank, spending on megaprojects continued, from futuristic desert cities to entertainment hubs designed to attract tourists and investors. Billions were allocated to diversify the economy into technology, finance, renewable energy, and sports. The strategy was bold: to position Saudi Arabia not only as the heart of the Arab and Islamic worlds, but also as a global hub of commerce and culture. International sporting events, film festivals, and concerts began to appear in a country that, only a decade earlier, had banned cinemas. Women were driving cars. Young Saudis were entering new industries, and global corporations were being courted with generous deals to relocate to Riyadh. At the same time, the kingdom continued to wield its traditional weapon, oil, with precision. As a de facto leader of OPEC+, Saudi Arabia coordinated production cuts and increases with Russia and other producers to stabilize the market. Its ability to influence prices reminded the world that, despite the rise of renewable energy, oil remained the lifeblood of the global economy, and Saudi Arabia still controlled the tap. But even as the kingdom modernized its image, shadows lingered. The war in Yemen dragged on, draining resources and staining Saudi Arabia's reputation. Human rights concerns, from the imprisonment of dissidents to the lingering aftermath of Jamal Khashoggi's murder, continued to spark global criticism. The leadership, however, seemed determined to push past these controversies, betting that money, investment, and spectacle would keep partners engaged and critics muted. By the mid-2020s, Saudi Arabia's sovereign wealth fund, the Public Investment Fund, had grown into one of the most powerful in the world, with stakes in everything from technology startups in Silicon Valley to sports teams in Europe. The kingdom was no longer just exporting oil. It was exporting capital, culture, and influence. Yet, questions remained. Could a nation so dependent on petroleum truly reinvent itself as a diversified financial empire? Could the social reforms introduced by MBS keep pace with the demands of a youthful population eager for change? And most importantly, would the House of Saud manage to maintain its grip on power as it guided the kingdom through one of the most ambitious transformations in modern history? Saudi Arabia today stands at crossroads between its past as a desert kingdom built on oil and its future as a global powerhouse built on vision, finance, and influence. Whether it succeeds or falters will not only shape the fate of the kingdom itself, but also ripple across the entire world. For Saudi Arabia has become too important to ignore. From the wind-swept desert of the early 20th century to the glass towers and mega projects of the 21st, Saudi Arabia's story is one of the most dramatic transformations in modern history. In less than a century, the kingdom went from a land of caravans and oases to a nation whose decisions rippled through every corner of the globe. At its heart lies oil, the black gold that gave Saudi Arabia both immense wealth and immense responsibility. With it came power, alliances, and influence. But with it also came dependency, vulnerability, and conflict. The rulers of the kingdom learned early that oil was more than just an energy source. It was a weapon, a bargaining chip, and the foundation of their rule. And yet, Saudi Arabia's journey has never been only about oil. It is also about religion, identity, and legitimacy. As custodian of Mecca and Medina, the kingdom holds spiritual authority that no amount of money can buy. This dual role, as both financial empire and religious guardian, makes Saudi Arabia unique. Its wealth shapes economies. Its faith shapes communities. Today, under the leadership of Crown Prince Mohammed bin Salman, the kingdom stands on the edge of a new era. Vision 2030 promises diversification, innovation, and modernization. Glittering projects like NEOM and futuristic tourism hubs are meant to signal that the Saudi Arabia of tomorrow will not only export oil, but also culture, finance, and technology. But the future is uncertain. Oil will one day lose its central place in the global economy. Climate change and renewable energy are already reshaping the world's demand. For Saudi Arabia, the challenge is existential. Can it truly escape the shadow of oil, or will it always be bound by the very resource that built its empire? Beyond economics, the kingdom must navigate society in transition. A youthful population with global ambitions demands more freedoms, more opportunities, and more transparency. The monarchy, for all its power, knows that its future depends on meeting these demands without losing control. The story of Saudi Arabia, then, is not finished. It is a living narrative, one of wealth and struggle, faith and politics, tradition and ambition. A kingdom forged in sand and oil now seeks to carve out a new identity in steel, glass, and innovation. Whether it succeeds or fails will not only decide its own destiny, but will also shape the course of the Middle East and the global order. As the sun sets over the Arabian desert and the lights of Riyadh blaze into the night, one truth remains. Saudi Arabia is no longer just a desert kingdom. It is a financial empire, a political force, and a nation whose choices reach far beyond its borders. The world watches, waits, and wonders, what future will this empire of oil and ambition choose for itself? And so, we leave you with this question. In the decades to come, will Saudi Arabia's story be remembered as a tale of a kingdom that adapted and thrived, or of one that rose too high, too fast, and was brought back down by the weight of its own wealth? If you've made it this far, share your thoughts with us in the comments. What do you think lies ahead for Saudi Arabia? And don't forget to subscribe to Zimo Voice for more documentaries that dive deep into the hidden stories shaping our world.